This session is why you need to detect more than PTH with Matt Hathaway and Jeff Myers. Thanks very much.
Thanks. So just get started. Who are we? Jeff and I both work at Rapid7. I got into security from credit card anti-fraud solutions and moved in to banking, things like that, and eventually got to Rapid7. I've been here about 2 years. Jeff got in security really at Rapid7. We hired him for incubation on a product, and so that's where how we got to here, and really just quickly get into what we're going to go through today. Hopefully this is what everybody expected today. Really want to talk about how stolen credentials are going to be stolen, why you can be sure of that fact, then start to look at how you cannot detect them, how we failed at it, give you very specific examples, and then start to show you what characteristics, what data to look for, where you can get that data, and Jeff's going to go through a few scenarios, actually showing you credentials being used, various authentications, what those log files look like, what the text is, what to look for, and then why that's not enough. Really why you need to do more than just alarm every time you see a specific characteristic. So a quick primer, make sure everybody in the room, as I start to use these terms, is familiar with them. When we say Active Directory security logs, we're talking about those stored on the domain controller. Very central to the organization. Most of the authentication should be stored there. We'll show you that's not all authentications are, but very, very useful tool and important for auditing various reasons. Windows event logs, generally during this talk, we're talking about on the endpoint, on a server, the local to the system event logs, and those are actually quite a bit different from what's on the domain controller. Account impersonation, I'm going to use this term a few times today. This doesn't, it sounds like it implies bad, but this is a normal thing. It's switching from one account to another. There are a lot of legitimate reasons that you see account impersonations in your organization. Single sign-on services like Okta and that type of service, machine account generally would log in as you. So that's an account impersonation. That's not bad, it's necessary for convenience. But also best practices, separate your domain admin account from their user account. They have to do an impersonation to authenticate as a domain admin. Windows management instrumentation. This is really just as simple as a management toolkit for endpoints to let you go on, make changes remotely from a local system. This is something that Rapid7, we have a lot of expertise, and you'll understand why I'm introducing that here. And then the second part of the primer is the real basics on pass to hash, and it's essentially a two-step process, right? Getting the hash on any system with LM and NTLM hashes being used. There are various reasons to try and stop it, mitigate it, whatever, but the fact is trying to grab it out of memory, out of a registry, various ways. There are different places to look for it. That's the first half. And then, of course, the second half is using that hash, of passing it. So whenever you're trying to authenticate, rather than ever needing the clear text password, you don't need to. You would just hand over the hash and authenticate with that. And as long as LM or NTLM protocols are supported for that authentication, you'll be in. And the reason that's still in place, decades-old systems like printers and various file sharing services all need that kind of authentication, and they haven't been updated to move on from there. So that's kind of important for one of our scenarios. Just wanted to go through that briefly. And now I'll go into a little bit. This slide might scare you thinking this is a marketing talk, but in fact, it really want to talk about, I'm a product manager, so I tend to do different slide decks here and there, and one day I was looking for a simple way to represent kind of the attacker mentality, and I was actually quite scared when I saw this. This is what came up on Google Images, looking at discover and expand, things like that. And it's because it's an existing model. It's a tried and true model. This isn't something that they just attackers just figured out, oh, well, let's figure out how to get in and move. It's just a common way to establish a base, get in, expand, and it's done in marketing, it's done in various businesses. So this model exists, it's a challenge, and it's also why I don't think it's just going to stop. It's not going to cease all of a sudden. So for those three different pieces, on the Discover side, we all know credentials are weak. It's been talked about a lot. Very convenient, so we continue to use them. Really hasn't been an alternative proposed. But we also don't work in a world where you can just put a stamp on it, like a condo key is supposed to have do not duplicate, and doesn't stop people from duplicating it. You can find places anywhere you want to just make you a copy. And so credentials are the same thing. All you have to do is hand it over and they can act as you. So that discovery side, stealing it, phishing someone, we all have seen phishing emails. They're still continue to be successful today, very easy to do, and they're involved in almost every breach that comes out in some manner. So reach, the fact is it only takes one entry point, one area that you didn't protect well, one spot in the perimeter, or just one person to fall for a phishing email, click a link, one system that's not fully secure. Just need one, and that's it. That's to get in. And so that's another reason why credentials will be stolen, and those stolen credentials will be used. And so that's kind of scary, but anyway. And then the last piece is expanding. So Microsoft released a great guide on how to mitigate past the hash. And obviously you need to follow through with that. Any type of prevention is important, but it's unrealistic to think that you're going to mitigate it on every system in your organization for every account. There's always an exception. There are always legitimate reasons. Something was in a rush. This IT project needed to get done. Whatever reasons you want. Windows 8.1, they again did some great security improvements. Did things like make it so the hash is never stored on the system as long as they're a protected user. There are a few other things that they did, but again, you would have to have every system in the organization upgraded to Windows 8.1 to really stop my previous point of it only takes one. So because of this is again really explaining why we started down this path and tried to find ways to detect it, because we're convinced they will continue to be stolen and used. And so, along those lines, how to detect it. So, it is detectable, various ways, various types of use. Pass the hash is an example, someone just using a clear text password from a different system, who knows? But we'll talk about a central place where we started, most people start. And then last year there was a great talk on passing the hash, and at the end they went through a few ways that they were finding the characteristics on the box, showing what they did. So we built off of that, and that was very useful. But we also ran into a lot of snags. The fact is, every administrator looks suspicious because, as I said, it's best practice to, as a user, surf the web and then authenticate to your domain admin, do that impersonation before you do any secure activities, any sort of administrative activities. And so you constantly see these impersonations. Once you're trying to detect it, that adds to the challenge. And so along those lines, another snag we hit is you can't just rely on one characteristic, and that's hopefully what we'll walk through, and you'll see from the examples we have. A lot of legitimate activity ends up looking suspicious when you first look at it. When you specifically desktop admin, somebody who doesn't have domain admin creds, if they come over to my system, install Skype for me, they elevated the privilege, suddenly looks like I'm impersonating him. So that's legitimate, but it's really confusing when you first start seeing it in logs. So those are some of the challenges we'll walk through. Where did we start? We started in that on the domain controller, looking at the centralized logs. Every authentication is supposed to be there, every domain level authentication. The fact is, it only tells you some of the details. It tells you which asset, but only, as we'll show, to some degree. It doesn't have every asset involved in authentication. It tells you which count is exactly authenticating, but impersonations are kind of secret to you. Administrative functions, these are really good out of the audit logs, seeing when somebody's promoted to domain admin, seeing if various changes are done, they're added to a group, or someone changes configuration on a system. All of that is great, and that is, we still use that today to detect malicious activity. But what's bad is you don't have the origination account when there's an impersonation. You don't know details about what kind of remote authentication. It's kind of just the fact that it was on the network. You don't know which unprivileged account became the domain admin when that was authenticated. And you have no idea. It's a complete blind spot for local accounts, which may not be something that are supposed to be used in most organizations, but it's really hard from centralized logging. You can't tell if they're being used at all. So with that, that's why we're really pushing, and we think it's absolutely mandatory to use event logs on the endpoints or servers or whatever local system if you want to see enough activity to detect stolen credentials being used. You need to look there. Things like admin accounts, ask your local pen tester, they'll tell you they can try admin on every single system in the company with a blank password and no alarm will go off. No account will be locked out, nothing will happen. They'll just be poking around, seeing and hoping to find one system where they still have a blank or default password. And so that's, if you want to see that, the event logs have that. It also tells you things like if event logs were recently deleted, which generally, I don't know about you, I'm not spending a lot of time deleting my event logs, but people that are going to delete them are attackers that are trying to hide their tracks. And also, they're just much richer. They have more data in the same events, maybe look like a duplicate until you start to look at more details around origination account, what type, as I said before, what type of networked authentication. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and he's going to have the fun of going through various scenarios.
All right, thanks, Matt. For the rest of the main body of the talk, I'm going to be talking through a few different types of authentication scenarios and the types of information that are logged in the various sources, whether we're talking about the domain controller, we're talking about the source system, or the target system. In these particular scenarios and the test environment that I set up for building out this information, we used Windows 2008 R2 for the domain controller, and the source and the target systems are all running Windows 7. The event codes and the details that are present in the logs vary from addition of Windows to addition of Windows, so your results might vary slightly. So the first scenario that we're going to talk about is a simple connection of RDPing from one system to another. We're going to go from a source system, Lab Club 2 DC1 to Lab Club 2 DC2, but we're going to do an impersonation. We're going to switch from a user named Alice to a user named Bob. So this is an awesome eye test right here, but for the purposes of this presentation, what we're going to do is we're going to take these raw logs that are the XML output from Windows event logging, and we're just going to distill out the relevant bits and pieces out of this to summarize and present in these slides rather than dealing with the XML. One other thing to note here is that the logs that you get from Windows are very chatty, they're very repetitive, so like a single action can spawn multiple 4624s, multiple 4648s. In those cases, we just simplified and just picked a representative example. Most of the times those repetitions are small details like changes in the process names that are doing the authentication or that sort of thing. All right, back to the example that we're going to start with. So again, using RDP to log in from system A to system B and changing users. On the domain controller, we see that we see an authentication from the source machine is listed as the workstation name, and we see that the target username is Bob. We're logging in as Bob. We see that there are authentications to the target machine. We see the 4648s and 4769s, that's a mouthful, about the system that's actually being logged in. But if you notice in all the details here, there's no indication of Alice at all. Alice was the source user that's doing the impersonation. So if we compare the logs that we get on the endpoints when we look at the target host first and the source host, on the target we see both the source host name and the IP address and the name of the target's user. So Bob shows up on the target host as expected. One other interesting bit here is that the target host is the only place where the specific log type of 4624 that you actually get the login type that indicates that this is a remote interactive login. This is something that Matt pointed out. Whenever you take a look at the events on the domain controller, all you see is the fact that there are network events, network logins occurring. You need to actually go to the endpoints to get the details to say, hey, this is an RDP connection. On the source host is the only place where you actually get the information about the fact that there is an impersonation going on, that you're switching from Alice to Bob. The source host also lists the target server name in that log message, which is great. So to summarize, if we compare all these different sources, if you're trying to get the complete picture of source user, source asset, target user, target asset, the source host is the only system that provides the full-fledged details. All right, so the second scenario that we're going to talk about is a login where you do an account escalation on an escalation of privileges on a particular system. So in this case, the user Alice is escalating privileges to a local account administrator on a particular machine. This can be normal, legit activity like the installation of software. Matt mentioned this for the installation of Skype. Or it could be for malicious purposes like somebody wants to do a hash dump against that system. So when you're running as a local administrator and that activity, nothing at all shows up in the domain controller event log. The only source of information you'll get about this activity at all is on that particular machine. So you see the information here, you see the source user and the target user. Another thing to note if you're just parsing and processing these logs for the first time, the only way you can really distinguish an administrator domain account from an administrator local account is the fact that the target domain name is the name of that system that the local account is for. Otherwise, it should be part of the domain, like the test dev is shown in the other examples. All right, now the interesting one. So we're going to talk about a scenario where we're going to execute a pass-a-hash attack with using Metasploit. So in this scenario, we have an actor named Craig, and he's going to do a multi-stage attack. So the first thing that he's going to do is he's going to communicate with this first system, Lab Club 2 DC1, to actually do the ripping of the hashes. He's then going to take the hashes that were extracted from that first system and use them to log in from a second system to a third system. So hopefully that's not too confusing, but the thing that we're really interested in probing here is the act of doing the passing of the hash, not the extraction process, the ripping process, because there are some signals left in the logs about that activity as well. So I'm not going to do a live demo of Metasploit, but and here's a quick screenshot showing the process of dumping hashes on that RIP target machine. And I highlighted on the screenshot here that and the connection to the system that is the RIP target, and at the very bottom there's the hash that was extracted for the local administrator account on that target system. And then the second screenshot is the actual act of passing the hash to execute the PS exec attack on the target system. Highlighted in the screenshot are the target IPs, the specification of the local admin hash that we got from the first screenshot as the credentials to use, and the resulting access with the administrator account on that third system. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Metasploit or PS exec, what's happening here in the screenshot is that we're authenticating to the administrative share on that third system using the hash as opposed to an actual password. We're copying over a executable payload to that share and remotely invoking it. That executable will then call back to Metasploit and open up an interactive system where you can effectively own that system and do whatever you want on it. So let's investigate what's left in the logs when the actual act of passing the hash occurs. So when performing the login with the hash, we found this very surprising, that on the domain controller there's actually a trace left about the that is related to the RIP source. So nothing mentions either the second system or the third system, but it indicates something was going on with the host system where the hash was taken, even though this is potentially days or weeks or months after the actual dumping of the hash occurred. On the target system, there's a log indicating that there was an authentication from the source system. And there's also a suspiciously randomly generated workstation name that's provided by Metasploit by default. And you also see that the login process name is NTLM-SSP, which is the authentication that is used for authenticating to the Samba share. Also noteworthy in this scenario is that when the pass the hash actually occurred, Metasploit used its own implementation of the SMB protocol, so no events related to this login were left on the source machine at all. All right, so now we're going to look at two more scenarios which are similar to the pass the hash attack that we just went over, with slight variances that are based on legitimate activity. So and in this particular scenario, a domain user is authenticating to the administrative share on a target system using our own domain credentials. This could be a legitimate use, like a lot of enterprise patching software applies this process of copying the patches down to the administrative share and then executing the process to actually trigger the installation of the software, as an example. So when the mount occurs, the domain controller sees an auth from the source machine, but there's no information about the target machine. So you see that Alice, the authentication from the domain controller's perspective, the validation of the credentials just occurred on the source machine, nothing related to the target machine. On the target machine, we get the source IP address and the valid workstation name, as opposed to what we saw when we were executing with Metasploit. In this case, since it's not an impersonation, we went from Alice's account to Alice's account. There was no information captured on the source host of this activity at all. All right, finally, we're going to talk about a similar authentication, except instead of logging into the domain account on that target system, we're going to do an impersonation. So we're going to log into the local administrator account on that target system This is the same account that was targeted by the pass the hash attack in the Metasploit case. So when making an authentication to the local account, it's considered an impersonation, so it's actually logged on the source host. It provides the information that this source user, Alice, did an impersonation to this target user, administrator. On the target system, we get the full-fledged details, very similar to what we were talking about earlier. You get the source, you get the same process, you get a valid workstation ID or name. It looks exactly like what we saw in Metasploit, other than the fact that the workstation name is valid. So in this case, because it's an authentication to a local account, there is nothing left on the domain controller at all. And that's it.
Thanks. Thanks, Jeff. So really what we went through here, this is a valid way to use the logs to build scripts. Hopefully you can take that back and try and detect these things yourselves. But our conclusion after going through all of this and seeing this activity, starting to track this kind of activity, was that you really also need to just understand what's normal in your organization and detect the differences. Because there's so much noise, there are so many, as we said before, legitimate activities that, as you saw, local accounts being used in general looks pretty suspicious. If you get those on the endpoint, that's great, but you can't just alarm every single time because then you'll just have too much noise to respond when it's truly a problem. So start to look for things. One good example would be the process being run, comparing the source host to known hosts in the organization. That would specifically work for the Metasploit pass the hash attack we showed. But if you could just spoof that, then again, you really need to know where specific users are authenticating to other systems from. Look at things like what user generally is linked to domain admin, which domain admin account. Even if your naming conventions make sense, sometimes you'll be surprised what you'll find. You'll fix a few problems, people misusing the accounts, but you'll also start to only alert when it's relevant, when you start to have an issue, a real concern. So that's really what we came here to talk about today. Really want to thank the Moose Dojo and the Metasploit team for helping us build out the lab and test through these scenarios. If you have any questions or you want the original raw logs that we generate through this, feel free to email us and we'll send that to you. Otherwise, we do have a little bit of time for questions right now if anybody has them.
So in the security event logs for authentications, oftentimes you'll get processes that are created as a result of that. Do you see in your analysis of the logs anything interesting in the processes that are created as you log in across the network? So for instance, process logging, but there are several of the security event logs that include process logging in addition to user logins.
Yeah, definitely, and that's an area where we're sort of trying to draw more conclusions from the process names. We are definitely capturing them, and it's just we need to take it further with analysis to see what sort of conclusions you can draw from the different scenarios and mapping them back to actual legit or non-legit user activity so that we can figure out what we want to alert on. But yeah, that's another very good source of information. Anyone else? All right, thank you very much.